Chapter 17 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 17. Butch Returns. He reminded Nash of some big puma cub warming itself at the hearth like a common tabby cat, a tame puma thrusting out its claws and turning its yellow eyes up to its owner, tame, but with infinite possibilities for danger. For the information which Nash had given seemed to remove all distrust of the moment before, and he became instantly genial, pleasant. In fact, he voiced this sentiment with a disarming frankness immediately. "Perhaps I've seemed to carry a chip on my shoulder, Mr. Nash. You see, I'm not long in the West, and people I've met seem to be ready to fight first and ask questions afterward. So I've caught the habit, I suppose. Which a habit like that ain't uncommon. The graveyards are full of fellers that had that habit, and they're going to be fuller still of the same kind." Here Sally entered, carrying the meal of the cowpuncher, arranged it, and then sat on the edge of Bard's table, turning from one side to the other as a bird on a spray of leaves turns from sunlight to shadow and cannot make a choice. "Bard," stated Nash, "is going out to the ranch with me tonight." "Long ride for tonight, isn't it?" "Yes, but we'll bunk on the way and finish up early in the morning." "Then you'll have a chance to teach him Western manners on the way, Steve." "Manners?" queried the Easterner, smiling up at the girl. She turned, caught him beneath the chin with one hand, tilting his face up, and raised the lessening forefinger of the other while she stared down at him with a half frown and half smile, like a schoolteacher about to discipline a recalcitrant boy. "Western manners," she said, "mean first not to doubt a man till he tries to double cross you, and not to trust him till he saves your life. To keep your gun inside the leather till you're backed up against the wall, and then start shootin' as soon as the muzzle is past the holster. Then the thing to remember is that fast shootin' is fine, but sure shootin' is better. Do you get me?" "That's a fine sermon," smiled Bard, "but you're too young to make a convincing preacher, Miss Fortune." "Miss Fortune," said the girl quickly, "don't have to be old to do a lot of teachin'." She sat back and regarded him with something of a frown and with folded arms. He said with a sudden earnestness: "You seem to take it for granted that I'm due for a lot of trouble." But she shook her head gloomily. "I know what you're due for. I can see it in your eyes. I can hear it in your way of talkin'. If you was to ride the range with a sheriff on one side and a marshal on the other, you couldn't help fallin' into trouble." "As a fortune teller," remarked Nash, "you make a good undertaker, Sally." "Shut up, Steve. I've seen this bird in action, and I know what I'm talkin' about. When you comin' back this way, Bard?" He said thoughtfully: "Perhaps tomorrow night. Perhaps—" "It ought to be tomorrow night," she said pointedly, her eyes on Nash. The latter had pushed his chair back a trifle and sat now with downward head and his right hand resting lightly on his thigh. Only the place in which they sat was illuminated by the two lamps, and the forward part of the room, nearer the street, was a seat of shadows, wavering when the wind stirred the flame in one of the lamps or sent it smoking up the chimney. Sally and Bard sat with their backs to the door and Nash half facing it. "Steve," she said with a sudden low tenseness of voice that sent a chill up Bard's spinal cord. "Steve, what's wrong?" "This," answered the cowboy calmly, and whirling in his chair his gun flashed and exploded. They sprang up in time to see the bulky form of Butch Conklin rise out of the shadows in the front part of the room with outstretched arms, from which a revolver dropped clattering to the floor. Backward he reeled as though a hand were pulling him from behind, and then measured his length with a crash to the floor. Bard, standing erect, quite forgot to touch his weapon, but Sally had produced a ponderous .45 with mysterious speed and now crouched behind a table with the gun poised. Nash, bending low, ran forward to the fallen man. "Nicked, but not done for," he called. "Thank God!" cried Sally, and the two joined Nash about the prostrate body. The bullet had had very certain intentions, but by a freak of chance it had been deflected on the angle of the skull and merely plowed a bloody furrow through the mat of hair from forehead to the back of the skull. He was stunned, but hardly more seriously hurt than if he had been knocked down by a club. "I've an idea," said the Easterner calmly, "that I owe my life to you, Mr. Nash." "Let that drop," answered the other. "A quarter of an inch lower," said the girl, who was examining the wound, and Butch would have kissed the world good bye. Not till then did the full horror of the thing dawn on Bard. The girl was no more excited than one of her Eastern cousins would have been over a game of bridge, and the man, in the most matter of fact manner, was slipping another cartridge into the cylinder of his revolver, which he then restored to the holster. It still seemed incredible that the man could have drawn his gun and fired in that flash of time. He recalled his adventure with Butch earlier that evening, and with Sandy Ferguson before. For the first time he realized what he had done, and a cold horror possessed him like the man who has nerves to walk the tightrope across the chasm and faints when he looks back on the gorge from the safety of the other side. The girl took command. "Steve, run down to the marshal's office. Deputy Glendon is there." She took the wet cloth and made a deft bandage for the head of Conklin. With his shaggy hair covered, and his face sagging with lines of weariness, the gunfighter seemed no more than a middle-aged man asleep, worn out by trouble. "Is there a doctor?" asked Bard anxiously. "That ain't a case for a doctor. Look here, you're in a blue faint. What is the matter?" "I don't know. I'm thinking of that quarter of an inch, which would have meant the difference to poor Conklin." "Poor Conklin? Why, you fish, he was sneaking in here to try his hand on you. He found he couldn't get his gang into town, so he slipped in by himself. He'll get 10 years for this, and 1,000 if they hold him up for the other things he's done." "I know, and this fellow Nash was quiet as the strike of a snake. If he'd been a fraction of a second slower, I might be where Conklin is now. I'll never forget Nash for this." She said pointedly, "No, he's a bad one to forget. Keep an eye on him. You spoke of a snake. That's how smooth Steve is. Remember your own motto, Miss Fortune. He saved my life, therefore I must trust him." She answered sullenly, "You're your own boss." "What's wrong with Nash? Find out for yourself. Are all these fellows something other than they seem? What about yourself?" "What do you mean? What trail are you on, Bard? Don't look so innocent. Oh, I seen you was after something a long time ago." "I am. After excitement, you know." "Ain't you finding enough?" "I've got 2 things ahead of me." "Well?" "This trip, and when I come back I think making love to you would be more exciting than gun plays." They regarded each other with bantering smiles. "A tenderfoot like you make love to me? That would be exciting, all right, if it wasn't so funny. As for competition," he said serenely, "that would be simply a good background." "Hate yourself, don't you, Bard?" She grinned. "The rest of these boys are all very well, but they don't see that what you want is the velvet touch." "What's that?" She was as frankly curious as some boy hearing a new game described. "You've only been loved in one way. These rough-handed fellows come in and throw an arm around you and ask you to marry them. Isn't that it? What you really need is an old, simple, very effective method." Though her eyes were shining, she yawned. "It don't interest me, Bard." "On the contrary, you're getting quite excited." "So does a horse before it gets ready to buck." "Exactly. If I thought it would be easy, I wouldn't be tempted." "Well, if you like fighting, you've sure mapped out a nice sizable quarrel with me, Bud." "Good. I'm certainly coming back to Eldara. Now about this method of mine." "Throwing your cards on the table, eh? What you got, Bard? A royal flush?" "Right again. It's a very simple method, but you couldn't beat it. Bud, you ain't half old enough to kid me. What you need," he persisted calmly, "is someone who would sit down and simply talk good plain English to you. Let her go. In the first place I will call attention to your method of dressing." "Anything wrong with it?" "I knew you'd be interested." She slipped into a chair and sat cross-legged in it, her elbows on her knees and her chin cupped in both her hands. "Sure, I'm interested. If there's a new way of fixin' ham and serve it out." "I would begin," he went on judiciously, "by saying that you dressed in 5 minutes in the dark." "It's generally dark at 5 a.m.," she admitted. You look on the whole as if you'd fallen into your clothes." The wounded man stirred and groaned faintly. She called, "Lie down, Butch. I'm busy. Go on, Bard." "If you keep a mirror, it's a wall decoration, not for personal use." "Maybe this is an old method, Bard, but around this place it'd be a quick way of getting shot." "Angry? You'd peeve a mule." "This was only an introduction. The next thing is to sit close beside you and shift the lamp so the light would shine on your face. Then take your hand." He suited his action to his word. "Let go my hand, Bard. It's like the rest of me, not a decoration, but for use." "Afraid of me, Sally?" "Not of a regiment like you." "Then of my method." "Go on, I'm game." "But this is all there is to it." "What do you mean?" "Just what I say. Having observed that you haven't set off any of your advantages, I will sit here and look into your face in silence, which is as much as to say that no matter how you dress you can't spoil a very excellent figure, Sally. I suppose you've heard that before." "Lots of times," she muttered. "But you wouldn't hear it from me. All I would do would be to sit here and stare and let you imagine what I'm thinking. And you'd begin to see that in spite of the way you do your hair you can't spoil its color nor its texture." He raised his other hand and touched it. "Like silk, Sally." He studied her closely, noting the flush which began to touch her cheeks. "Part of the game is for you to keep looking me in the eye." "Well, I'll be—" "Go on, I'm game." "It's hard to sit like this silently. Do I do it badly?" "No, you show lots of practice. How many have you tried this method on, Bard?" He made a vague gesture, then smiling, "Millions, Sally, and they all liked it." "So do I." And they laughed together and grew serious at the same instant. "All silence like this?" she queried. "No, after a while I would say, 'You are beautiful.' You don't get a blue ribbon for that, Bard." "Not the words, but the way they're said, which shows I mean them." She blinked as though to clear her eyes and then met his stare again. "You know you are beautiful, Sally. With pug nose, freckles, and all that. Just a tip tilt in the nose, Sally. Why, it's charming. And you have everything else, young, strong, graceful, clear." "What do you mean by that?" "Clear, fresh and colorful like the sunset over the desert. Do you understand?" Her eyes went down to consider. "I suppose I do. With a touch of awe in it, because the silence and the night are coming, and the stars walk down one by one, and the wind is low, soft, musical, whispering as you do now. What if this was not a game of suppose, Sally?" She wrenched herself suddenly away, rising. "I'm tired of supposing," she cried. "Then we'll call it all real. What of that?" That color was unmistakably high now. It ran down from her cheeks and even stained the pure white of her throat, where the flap of her shirt was open. He was excited as a hunter who had tracked some new and dangerous animal and at last driven it to bay, holding his gun poised and not knowing whether or not it will prove vulnerable. He stepped close, eager, prepared for any wild burst of temper, but she let him take her hands, let him draw her close, bend back her head, hold her closer still, till the warmth and softness of her body reached him. But when his lips came close she said quietly, "Are you a rotter, Bard?" He stiffened and the smile went out of his lips. He stepped back. She repeated, "Are you a rotter?" He raised the one hand which he still retained and touched it to his lips. "I am very sorry," said Anthony. "Will you forgive me?" And with her eyes large and grave upon him she answered, "I wonder if I can." Butch Conklin looked up, raising his bandaged head slowly, like a white flag of truce with a stain of red growing through the cloth. He stared at the two, raised his hand to his head as though to rub away the dream, found a pain too real for a dream, and then, like a crab which has grown almost too old to walk, waddled on hands and knees slowly from the room and melted into the dark beyond. Chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 18. Foolish Habits. A sharp noise of running feet leapt from the dust of the street and clattered through the doorway. The two turned. A swarthy man, broad of shoulder, was the first, and afterward appeared Nash. "Conklin," called Deputy Glendon, and swept the room with his startled glance. "Where's Conklin?" He was not there. Only a red stain remained on the floor to show where he had lain. "Where's Conklin?" called Nash. "I'm afraid," whispered Bard quickly to the girl, "that it was more than a game of suppose." He said easily to the other two, "He had enough. His share of trouble came tonight. I let him go." "Young feller," growled Glendon, "you ain't been in town a long while, but I've heard a pile too much about you already. What you mean by taking the law into your own hands?" "Wait," said Nash, his keen eyes on the two. "I guess I understand." "Let's have it, then." Still the steady eyes of Nash passed from Sally Fortune to Bard and back again. "This feller being a tenderfoot, he don't understand our ways. Maybe he thinks the range is a bit freer than it is." "That's the trouble," answered Glendon. "He thinks too damn much." "And does quite a pile besides thinkin'," murmured Nash, but too low for the others to hear. He hesitated, and then, as if making up his mind by a great effort, "There ain't no use in blamin' him. Better let it drop, Glendon." "Nothin' else to do, Steve. But it's funny Sally let him do it." "It is," said Nash with emphasis. "But then women is pretty funny in lots of ways. Ready to start, Bard?" "All ready." "So long, Sally." "Good night, Miss Fortune." "Evenin', boys. We'll be lookin' for you back in Eldara tomorrow night, Bard." And her eyes fixed with meaning on Nash. "Certainly," answered the other. "My business ought not take longer than that." "I'll take him by the shortest cut," said Nash, and the two went out to their horses. They had difficulty in riding the trail side by side, for though the roan was somewhat rested by the delay in Eldara, it was impossible to keep him up with Bard's prancing piebald, which sidestepped at every shadow. Yet the tenderfoot never allowed his mount to pass entirely ahead of the roan, but kept checking him back hard, turning toward Nash with an apology each time he surged ahead. It might have been merely that he did not wish to precede the cowpuncher on a trail which he did not know. It might have been something quite other than this which made him constantly keep to the rear. Nash felt certain that the second possibility was the truth. In that case his work would be doubly hard. From all that he had seen the man was dangerous. The image of the tame puma returned to him again and again. He could not see him plainly through the dark of the night, but he caught the sway of the body and recognized a perfect horsemanship, not a Western style of riding, but a good one no matter where it was learned. He rode as if he were sewed to the back of the horse, and, as old William Drew had suggested, he probably did other things up to the same standard. It would have been hard to fulfill his promise to Drew under any circumstances with such a man as this, but with Bard apparently forewarned and suspicious, the thing became almost impossible. Almost, but not entirely so. He set himself calmly to the problem. On the horn of his saddle the lariat hung loose. If the Easterner should turn his back for a single instant during the time they were together, old Drew should not be disappointed, and 1,000 cash would be deposited for the mutual interest of Sally Fortune and himself. That is to say, if Sally would consent to become interested. To the silent persuasion of money, however, Nash trusted many things. The roan jogged sullenly ahead, giving all the strength of his gallant, ugly body to the work. The piebald mustang pranced like a dancing master, beside and behind with a continual jingling of the tossed bridle. The masters were to a degree like the horses they rode, for Nash kept steadily leaning to the front, his bulldog jaw thrusting out, and Bard was forever shifting in the saddle, settling his hat, humming a tune, whistling, talking to the piebald, or asking idle questions of the things they passed, like a boy starting out for a vacation. So they reached the old house of which Nash had spoken, a mere shapeless black heap huddling through the night. In the shed to the rear they tied their horses and unsaddled. In the single room of the shanty, afterwards, Nash lighted a candle, which he produced from his pack, placed it in the center of the floor, and unrolled their blankets on the two bunks which were built against the wall on either side of the narrow apartment. Truly it was a crazy shack, such a building as two men, having materials at hand, might have put together in a single day. It was hardly on a foundation, but rather set on the sloped side of the hill, and accordingly had settled down on the lower side toward the door. Not an old place, but the wind had pried and the rain had warped generous cracks between the boards through which the rising storm whistled and sang, and through which the chill mist of the coming rain cut at them. Now and then a feeling came to Anthony that the gale might lift the tottering old shack and roll it down the hillside to the floor of the valley, for it rocked and swayed under the breath of the storm. In a way it was as if the night was giving a loud voice to the silent struggle of the two men, who continued pleasant, careless with each other. But when Nash stepped across the room behind Bard, the latter turned and was busy with the folding of his blankets at the foot of his bunk, his face toward the cowpuncher, and when Bard, slipping off his belt, fumbled at his holster, Nash was instantly busy with the cleaning of his own gun. The cattleman, having removed his boots, his hat, and his belt, was ready for bed and slipped his legs under the blankets. He stooped and picked up his lariat, which lay coiled on the floor beside him. "People gets foolish habits on the range," he said, thumbing the strong rope curiously, and so doing spreading out the noose. "Yes," smiled Bard, and he also sat up in his bunk. "It's like a kid. Give him a new toy and he wants to take it to bed with him. Ever notice?" "Surely. It's that way with me. When I go to bed nothing matters except that I have my lariat around. I generally like to have it hanging on a nail at the head of my bunk. The fellers always laugh at me, but I can't help it. Makes me feel more at home." And with that, still smiling at his own folly in a rather shamefaced way, he turned in his blankets and dropped the big coil of the lariat over a nail which projected from the boards just over the head of his bunk. The noose was outermost and could be disengaged from the nail by a single twist of the cowpuncher's hand as he lay passive in his bunk. On this noose Bard cast a curious eye. To city folk a piece of rope was a harmless thing with which to make a trunk secure, or on occasion construct a clothesline on the roof of the apartment building or in the kitchen on rainy Mondays. To a sailor the rope is nothing and everything at once. Give a seaman a piece of string and he will amuse himself all evening making lashings and knots. A piece of rope calls up in his mind the stout lines which hold the masts steady and the yards true in the gale, the comfortable cable which moors the ship at the end of a dreary voyage, and 1,000 things between. To the Westerner a rope is a different thing. It is not so much a useful material as a weapon. An Italian, fighting man to man, would choose a knife. A Westerner would take in preference that same harmless piece of rope. In his hands it takes on a life, it gains a strange and sinister quality. One instant it lies passive, or slowly whirled in a careless circle. The next its noose darts out like the head of a striking cobra. The coil falls and fastens, and then it draws tighter and tighter, remorselessly as a boa constrictor, paralyzing life. Something of all this went through the mind of Bard as he lay watching the limp noose of the cowboy's lariat, and then he nodded smiling. "I suppose that seems an odd habit to some men, but I sympathize with it. I have it myself, in fact. And whenever I'm out in the wilds and carry a gun, I like to have it under my head when I sleep. That's even queerer than your fancy, isn't it?" And he slipped his revolver under the blankets at the head of his bunk. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 19. The Candle. "Yes," said Nash, "that's a queer stunt, because when you're lying like that with your head right over the gun, and the blankets in between, It'd take a couple of seconds to get it out. Not when you're used to it. You'd be surprised to see how quickly a man can get the gun from under." "That's so." "Yes, and shooting while you're lying on your back is pretty easy, too, when you've had practice." "Sure, with a rifle, but not with a revolver. Well, do you see that bit of paper in the corner up there on the rafter?" "Yes." The hand of Bard whipped under his head. There was a gleam and a whirl of steel, an explosion, and the bit of paper came fluttering down from the rafter, like a wounded bird struggling to keep upon the air. A cold draft caught the paper just before it landed and whirled it through the doorless entrance and out into the night. He was yawning as he restored the gun beneath the blanket, but from the corner of his eye he saw the hardening of Nash's face, a brief change which came and went like the passing of a shadow. "That's something I'll remember," drawled the cowpuncher. "You ought to," answered the other quickly. "It comes in handy now and then. Feel sleepy?" The candle guttered and flickered on the floor midway between the two bunks, and Bard, glancing at it, was about to move from his bed and snuff it, but at the thought of doing so it seemed to him as if he could almost sense with prophetic mind the upward dart of the noose about his shoulders. He edged a little lower in the blankets. "Not a bit. How about you?" "Me? I most generally lie awake a while and gab after I hit the hay. Makes me sleep better afterward. I do the same thing when I've got someone who listens to me or talks to me. Queer how many habits we got the same, eh?" "It is, but after all, most of us are more alike than we care to imagine." "Yes, there ain't much difference. Sometimes the difference ain't as much as a split-second watch could catch, but it may mean that one feller passes out and the other goes on." They lay half facing each other, each with his head pillowed on an arm. "By Jove, lucky we reached the shelter before this rain came." "Yep, a couple hours of this and the rivers will be up. May take up all day to get back to the ranch if we have to ride up to the ford on the Saverack." "Then we'll swim 'em." The other smiled dryly. "Swim the Saverack when she's up? No, lad, we won't do that." "Then I'll have to work it alone, I suppose. You see, I have that date in Eldara tomorrow night." Nash set his teeth to choke back the cough. He produced papers and tobacco, rolled a cigarette with lightning speed, lighted it, and inhaled a long puff. "Sure, you ought to keep that date, but maybe Sally would wait till the night after. She impressed me, on the whole, as not being of the waiting kind." A little delay does 'em good. Gives 'em a chance to think. Why, every man has his own way with women, I suppose, but my idea is, keep them busy. Never give them a chance to think. If you do, they generally waste the chance and forget you altogether. Another coughing spell overtook Nash and left him frowning down at the glowing end of his butt. "She ain't like the rest." "I wonder," mused the Easterner. He had an infinite advantage in this duel of words, for he could watch under the shadow of his long, dark lashes the effect of his speeches on the cowboy, yet never seemed to be looking. For he was wondering whether the enmity of Nash, which he felt as one feels an unknown eye upon him in the dark, came from their rivalry about the girl or from some deeper cause. He was inclined to think that the girl was at the bottom of everything, but he left his mind open on the subject. And Nash, pondering darkly and silently, measured the strength of the slender stranger and felt that if he were the club, the other was the knife which made less sound but might prove more deadly. Above all, he was conscious of the Easterner's superiority of language, which might turn the balance against him in the ear of Sally Fortune. He dropped the subject of the girl. "You was huntin' over on the old place on the other side of the range?" "Yes." "Pretty fair run of game?" "Rather." "I think you said something about Logan." "Did I? I've been thinking a good deal about him. He gave me the wrong tip about the way to Eldara. When I get back to the old place—" "Well?" The other smiled unpleasantly and made a gesture as if he were snapping a twig between his hands. "I'll break him in two." The eyes of Nash grew wide with astonishment. He was remembering that same phrase on the lips of the big, gray man, Drew. He murmured, "That may give you a little trouble. Logan's a peaceable chap." but he has his record before he got down as low as sheep herdin'. I like trouble, now and then." A pause. "Odd old shack over there. Drew's old house?" "Yes. There's a grave in front of it." "There's quite a yarn inside the grave." The cowpuncher was aware that the other stirred. Not much, but as if he winced from a drop of cold water. He felt that he was close on the trail of the real reason why the Easterner wished to see Drew. "A story about Drew's wife? You read the writing on the headstone, eh? 'Joan, she chose this place for rest,'" quoted Bard. "That was all before my time. It was before the time of any others in these parts, but a few of the graybeards know a bit about the story, and I've gathered a little of it from Drew, though he ain't much of a talker." "I'd like to hear it." Sensitively aware of Bard, as a photographic plate is aware of light on exposures, the cowpuncher went on with the tale. And Bard, his glance probing among the shadowy rafters of the room, seemed to be searching there for the secret on whose trail he rode. Through the interims the rain crashed and volleyed on the roof above them, the cold spray whipped down on them through the cracks, the wind shook and rattled the crazy house, and the drawling voice of Nash went on and on. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 20. Joan. Them were the days when this was a man's country, which a man could climb on his hoss with a gun and a rope and touch heaven and hell in one day's ridin'. Them good old days ain't no more. I've heard the old men tell about 'em. Now they've got everybody stamped and branded with law and order, herded together like cattle, ticketed, done for. That's the way the range is now. The marshals have us by the throat. In the old days a sheriff that outlived his term was probably crooked and runnin' hand in hand with the long riders." "Long riders?" queried Bard. "Fellers that got tired of workin' and took to ridin' for a living. Mostly they worked in little gangs of 5 or 6. They was called long riders, I guess, partly because they was in the saddle all the time, and partly because they done their jobs so far apart. They'd ride into Kildare and blow up the safe in the bank one day, for instance, and 5 days later they'd be 250 miles away stoppin' a train at Lewis Station. They never hung around no one part of the country, and that made it hard as hell to run 'em down. That, and because they had the best hosses that money could buy. They had friends, too, strung out all over, squatters and the like of that. They'd drop in on these little fellers and pass 'em a couple 20s, and make themselves solid for life. Afterward they used 'em for stoppin' places. They'd pull off a couple of hold-ups, then ride off to one of these squatter places and lay up for 10 days, maybe drinkin' and feedin' up themselves and their hosses. That was the only way they was ever caught. They was killed off by each other, fightin' about the split up or something like that. But now and then a gang held together long enough to raise so much hell that they got known from one end of the range to the other. Mostly they held together because they had a leader who knew how to handle 'em and who kept 'em under his thumb. That was the way with old Pato. He had 5 men under him. They was all hellbenders who had ridden the range alone and had their share of fights and killin's, which there wasn't one of 'em that wouldn't have been good enough to go leader in any other crew, but they had to knuckle under to old Pato. He was a great gunman, and he was pretty good in schemin' up ways of dodgin' the law and pickin' up the best booty. He had these 5 men, and then he had his daughter, Joan. She was better'n any 2 ordinary men herself. 3 years that gang held together and got rich, fair rich. They made it so fast they couldn't even gamble the stuff away. About 1,000 times I guess posses went out after Pato, but they never came back with a trace of 'em, never got within shootin' distance. Finally Pato got so confident that he started raidin' ranches and carryin' off members of well-off ranchers to hold for ransom. That was the easiest way of makin' money. It was also pretty damn dangerous. One time they held up a stage, and picked off of it 2 kids who was comin' out from the East to try their hands in the cattle business. They was young, they looked like gentlemen, they was dressed nifty, they packed big rolls. So wise old Piotto took 'em off into the hills and held 'em till their folks back East could wire out the money to save 'em. That was easy money for Piotto, but it was the beginning of the end for him, because while they was waitin', them 2 kids seen Joan, and seen her good. I been tellin' you she was better'n 2 common men. She was. Which means she was equal to about 10 ordinary girls. There's still a legend about how beautiful Joan Piotto was. Tall and straight and big black eyes and terrible handy with her gun. She could ride anything that walked, and she didn't know what fear meant. These 2 kids seen her. One of 'em was William Drew. One of 'em was John Bard. He turned to Anthony and saw that the latter was stern of face. He had surely scored his point. "Same name as yours, eh?" he asked, to explain his turning. "It's a common enough name," murmured Bard. "Well, them 2 come out to be partners, and they was fallin' in love with the same girl. So when they got free they put their heads together, bein' uncommon wise kids, and figured it out this way. Neither of 'em had a chance workin' alone to get Joan away from her father's gang, but workin' together they might have a ghost of a show. So they decided to stay on the trail of Piotto till they got Joan. Then they'd give her a choice between the 2 of 'em, and the one that lost would simply back off the boards. They done what they agreed. For 6 months they stuck on the trail of old Piotto, and never got in hailin' distance of him. Then they come on the gang while they were restin' up in the house of a squatter. That was a pretty night. Drew and Bard went through that gang. It sounds like a fairy story, all right, but I know fellers who will swear it's true. They killed 3 of the men with their guns. They knifed another one, and they killed Riley with their bare hands. It wasn't no pretty sight to see inside that house. And last of all they got Piotto fightin' like a wildcat into a corner with his daughter. And William Drew, he took Piotto in his arms and busted his back. That don't sound possible, but when you see Drew you'll know how it was done. The girl, she'd been knocked cold before this happened. So when Bard and Drew sat together bindin' up their wounds, because they was shot pretty near to pieces, they talked it over, and they seen pretty clear that the girl would never marry the man that killed her father. Of course, old Bill Drew, he'd done the killin', but that wasn't any reason he had to take the blame. They made up their minds right there and then, with the dead men lyin' all around 'em. They'd match coins to see which one would take the blame for havin' killed Piotto, meanin' that the other would get the girl, if he could. And Bard lost. So he had to take credit for havin' killed old Piotto. I'd have give somethin' to have seen those 2 sittin' there, oozin' blood after that matchin' was decided. Because they tell me that Bard was as big as Drew and looked pretty much the same. Then Bard, he asked Drew to let him have one chance at the girl, lettin' her know first what he'd done, but just trustin' to his power of talk, which, of course, didn't give him no show. While he was makin' love to the girl, she outs with a knife and tries to stick him. Nice pleasant sort she must have been. And Drew had to pry the 2 of 'em apart. That made the girl look sort of kind on Drew, and she swore that sooner or later she'd have the blood of Bard for what he'd done. Either have it herself, or else send someone after him to the end of the world. She was a wild one, all right. She was so wild that Drew, after they got married, took her over to the far side of the range and built that house that's rottin' over there now. Bard, he left the range and wasn't never seen again, far's I know." It was clear to Anthony, bitterly clear. His father had had a grim scene in parting with Drew, and had placed the continent between them. And in the eastern states he had met that black-eyed girl, his mother, and loved her because she was so much like the wild daughter of Piotto. The girl Joan, in dying, had probably extracted from Drew a promise that he would kill Bard, and that promise he lived to fulfill. "So Joan died?" he queried. "Yep, and was buried under them 2 trees in front of the house. I don't think she lived long after they was married, but about that nobody knows. They was clear off by themselves, and there isn't any one can tell about their life after they was married. All we know is that Drew didn't get over her dyin'. He ain't over it yet, and he goes out to that old place every month or so to potter around the grave, and keep the grass and the weeds off it, and clean the headstone. The candle guttered wildly on the floor. It had burnt almost to the wood, and now the remnant of the wick stood in a little sprawling pool of grease, white at the outer edges. Bard yawned and patted idly the blanket where it touched the shape of the revolver beneath. In another moment the candle would gutter out, and they would be left in darkness. He said, "That's the best yarn I've heard in a good many days. It's enough to make anyone sleepy. So here goes," and he turned deliberately on his side. Nash, his eyes staring with incredulity, sat up slowly among his blankets, and his hand stole toward the noose of the lariat. A light snore reached him, hardly a snore so much as a heavy intake of breath of a very weary sleeping man. Yet the hand of Nash froze on the lariat. "By God," he whispered faintly to himself, "he ain't asleep." And the candle flared wildly, leapt, and shook out. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 21. The Swimming of the Savar. Over the face of Nash the darkness passed like a cold hand, and a colder sense of failure touched his heart. But men who have ridden the range have one great power surpassing all others, the power of patience. As soundlessly as he had pushed himself up the moment before, he now slipped back in the blankets and resigned himself to sleep. He knew that he would wake at the first hint of gray light, and trusted that after the long ride of the day before his companion would still be fast asleep. That half light would be enough for his work. But when he roused while the room was still scarcely more visible than if it were filled with a gray fog, he found Bard already up and pulling on his boots. "How'd you sleep?" he growled, following the example of the tenderfoot. "Not very well," said the other cheerily. "You see, that story of yours was so vivid in my mind that I stayed awake all night, I guess, thinking it over." "I knew it," murmured Nash to himself. He was awake all the time, and still. If that thrown noose of the lariat had settled over the head and shoulders of the sham sleeper, it would have made no difference whether he waked or slept. In the end he would have sat before William Drew tied hand and foot. If that noose had not settled. The picture of the little piece of paper fluttering to the floor came back with a strange vividness to the mind of Nash, and he had to shrug his shoulders and shake the thought away. They were in the saddle a very few moments after they woke, and started out breakfastless. The rain long ago had ceased, and there was only the solemn silence of the brown hills around them, silence, and a faint crinkling sound as if the thirsty soil still drank. It had been a heavy fall of rain, they could see, for whenever they passed a bare spot where no grass grew, it was crossed by thick tracery of the rivulets which had washed down the slopes during the night. Soon they reached the little creek whose current, barely knee deep, foamed up around the shoulders of the horses and set them staggering. "The Savar will be hell," said Nash, "and we'd better cut straight to the ford. How long will it take?" "Add about 3 hours to the trip." "Can't do it. Remember that little date back in Kildare tonight." "Then look for yourself and make up your mind for yourself," said Nash, dryly, for they topped a hill, and below they saw a mighty yellow flood pouring down the valley. It went leaping and shouting as if it rejoiced in some destruction it had worked, and was still working, and the muddy torrent was threaded with many a ridge of white and swirling with bubbles. "The Savar," said Nash. "Now what do you think about fording it?" "If we can't ford it, we can swim it," declared Bard. "Look at that tree trunk. If it will float, I will float. And if I can float, I can swim. And if I can swim, I'll reach the other bank of that little creek. Won't we, boy?" And he slapped the proud neck of the mustang. "Swim it?" said Nash incredulously. "Does that date mean as much as that to you?" "It isn't the date, it's the promise I gave," answered the other, watching the current with a cool eye. "Besides, when I was a youngster I used to do things like this for the sport of it." They rowed down to the edge of the stream. "How about it, Nash? Will you take the chance with me?" And the other, looking down: "Try the current. I'll stay here on the shore, and if it gets too strong for you I'll throw you a rope, eh? But if you can make it, I'll follow suit." The other cast a somewhat wistful eye of doubt upon the cowpuncher. "How far is it to the ford?" he asked. "About 8 miles," answered Nash, doubling the distance on the spot. 8 miles?" repeated the other ruefully. "Too far. Then here goes, Nash." Still never turning his back on the cowpuncher, who was now uncoiling his lariat and preparing for a cast, Bard edged the piebald into the current. He felt the mustang stagger as the water came knee deep, and he checked the horse, casting his eye from shore to shore and summing up the chances. If it had been simply water against which he had to contend, he would not have hesitated. But here and there along the course sharp-pointed rocks and broad-backed boulders loomed, and now and then, with a mighty splashing and crashing, one of these was overbalanced by the force of the current and rolled another toward the far-off sea. That rush of water would carry him far downstream, and the chances were hardly more than even that he would not strike against one of these murderous obstructions about which the current foamed. An impulse made him turn and wave a hand at Nash. He shouted: "Give me luck?" "Luck?" roared the cowboy, and his voice came as if faint with distance over the thunder of the stream. He touched the piebald with his spurs, and the gallant little horse floundered forward, lost footing, and struck into the water beyond its depth. At the same instant Bard swung clear of the saddle and let his body trail out behind, holding with his left hand to the tail of the struggling horse, and kicking to aid the progress. Immersed to the chin and sometimes covered by a more violent wave, the sound of the river grew at once strangely dim, but he felt the force of the current tugging at him like 1,000 invisible hands. He began to wish he had taken off his boots before entering, for they weighed his feet so that it made him leg-weary to kick. Nevertheless he trusted in the brave heart of the mustang. There was no wavering in the wild horse. Only his head showed over the water, but the ears were pricking straight and high, and it never once swerved back toward the nearer shore. Their progress was good at first, but as they neared the central portion of the water, they were swept many yards downstream for one that they made in a transverse direction. Twice they missed projecting rocks by the narrowest margin, and then something like an exceedingly thin and exceedingly strong arm caught Anthony around the shoulders. It tugged back, stopped all forward progress, and let them sweep rapidly down the stream and back toward the shore. Turning his head, he caught a glimpse of Nash sitting calmly in the saddle, holding the rope with both hands, and laughing. The next instant he saw no more, for the current placed a taller rock between him and the bank. On that rock the line of the lariat caught, hooking the swimmers sharply toward the bank. He would have cut the rope, but it would be almost impossible to get out a knife and open the blade with his teeth, still clinging to the tail of the swimming horse with one hand. He reached down through the water, pulled out his Colt, and with an effort swung himself about. Close at hand he could not reach the rope, and therefore he fired not directly at the rope itself, but at the edge of the rock around which the lariat bent at a sharp angle. The splash of the bullet from the strong face of the rock sliced the rope like a knife. It snapped free, and the brave little mustang straightened out again for the shore. An instant more Bard swam with the revolver poised above the water, but he caught no glimpse of Nash. He restored it with some difficulty to the holster, and gave all his attention and strength to helping the horse through the water, swimming with one hand and kicking vigorously with his feet. Perhaps they would not have made it, for now through exhaustion the ears of the mustang were drooping back. He shouted, and at the faint sound of his cheer the piebald pricked a single weary ear. He shouted again, and this time not for encouragement, but from exultation. A swerving current had caught them and was bearing them swiftly toward the desired bank. It failed them when they were almost touching bottom, and swung sharply toward the center again, but the mustang, as though it realized that this was the last chance, fought furiously. Anthony gave the rest of his strength, and they edged through inch by inch, and horse and man staggered up the bank and stood trembling with fatigue. Glancing back, he saw Nash in the act of throwing his lariat on the ground, wild with anger, and before he could understand the meaning of this burst of temper over a mere spoiled lariat, the gun whipped from the side of the cowboy, exploded, and the little piebald, with ears pricked sharply forward as though in vague curiosity, crumpled to the ground. The suddenness of it took all power of action from Bard for the instant. He stood staring stupidly down at the dying horse and then whirled, gun in hand, frantic with anger and grief. Nash was galloping furiously up the bank of the Saverack, already safely out of range, and speeding toward the ford. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 22. Drew Smiles. When he saw Bard scramble up the opposite bank, he knew that the game was lost and all the tables reversed, for the Easterner was a full 2 hours closer to the home of Drew than he was, with the necessary detour up to the ford. The Easterner might be delayed by the unknown country for a time, but not very long. He was sure to meet someone who would point the way. It was then that Nash drew his gun and shot the piebald mustang. The next instant he was racing straight up the river toward the ford. The roan was not spared this day, for there were many chances that Bard might secure a fresh mount to speed him on the way to the Drew ranch, and now it was all important that the big gray man be warned, for there was danger in that meeting, as Nash was beginning to feel. By noon he reached the house and went straight to the owner, a desperate figure, spattered with mud to the eyes, a 3 days' growth of whiskers blackening in his face, and that face gaunt with the long hard riding. He found the imperturbable Drew deep in a book in his office. While he was drawing breath, the rancher examined him with a faint smile. "I thought this would be the end of it," he announced. "The devil and all hell plays on the side of Bard," answered the foreman. "I had him safe, almost tied hand and foot. He got away." "Got away?" "Shot the rope in two." The other placed a bookmark, closed the volume, and looked up with utmost serenity. "Try again," he said quietly. "Take half a dozen men with you. Surprise him in the night." "Surprise a wolf?" growled Nash. "It's just the same." The shaggy eyebrows stirred. "How far is he away?" 2-3 miles. Maybe half a dozen. I don't know. He'll be here before night." The big man changed color and gripped the edge of the desk. Nash never dreamed that it would be possible to so stir him. "Coming here?" "Yes." "Nash, you infernal fool, did you let him know where you were taking him?" "No, he was already on his way here." Once more Drew winced. He rose now and strode across the room and back. From the wall the heavy echo of his footfall came sharply back. And he paused in front of Nash, looming above his foreman like some primitive monster, or as the Grecian heroes loomed above the rank and file at the siege of Troy. He was like a relic of some earlier period, when bigger men were needed for a greater physical labor. "What does he want?" "I don't know. Says he wants to ask for the right of hunting on your old place on the other side of the ridge. Which I'd tell a man it's just a lie. He knows he can hunt there if he wants." "Does he know me?" "Just your name." "Did he ask many questions about me?" "Wanted to know what you looked like." "And you told him?" "A lot of things. Said you were big and gray, and I told him the story about you and John Bard." Drew slumped into a chair and ground the knuckles of his right hand across his forehead. The white marks remained as he looked up again. "What was that?" "How you happened to marry Joan Pato, and how Bard left the country. Is that all?" "Is there any more, sir?" The other stared into the distance, overlooking the question. Tell me what you found out about him." "I've been after him for 3 days. Logan tipped him wrong, and he started the south trail for Eldara. I got on his trail 3 times and couldn't catch him till we hit Eldara." "I thought that roan of yours was the most durable horse on the range, Steve. You've often told me so." "He is." "But you couldn't catch Bard?" "He was on a faster horse than mine for a while." "Well, isn't he now?" "I killed the horse." "You showed your hand, then." "He knows you were sent after him." "No, he thinks it's because of a woman." "Is he tangling himself up with some girl?" frowned the rancher. "He's cutting in on me with Sally Fortune, damn his heart." And Nash paled visibly, even through the whiskers and mud. The other almost smiled. "So soon, Nash?" "With hosses and women he don't lose no time." "What's he done?" "The first trace I caught of him was at a shack of an old ranch house where he'd traded his lame horse in. They gave him the wildest mustang they had, a hoss that was saddle shy and that hadn't never been ridden. He busted that hoss in, a little piebald mustang, tougher'n iron, and that was why I didn't catch him till we hit Eldara." The smile was growing more palpable on the face of Drew, and he nodded for the story to continue. "Then I came to a house which was all busted up because Bard had come along and flirted with the girl, and she's got too proud for the feller she was engaged to. Begun thinkin' of millionaires right away, I s'pose. Next I tracked him to Flanders' saloon, where he'd showed up Sandy Ferguson the day before and licked him bad. I seen Ferguson. It was sure some lickin'." "Ferguson? The gunfighter? The two-gun man?" "Him." "Ah," drawled the big man. The color was back in his face. He seemed to be enjoying the recountal hugely. "Then I hit Eldara and found all the lights out." "Because of Bard?" He'd had a run-in with Butch Conklin, and Butch threatened to come back with all his gang and wipe Eldara off the map. He stuck around, and while he was waitin' for Butch and his gang, he started flirtin' with Sally Fortune." The name seemed to stick in his throat, and he had to bring it out with a grimace. "So now you want his blood, Nash?" "I'll have it," said the cowpuncher quietly. "I've a gambler's luck. In the end I'm sure I'll win." "You're not going to win here, Nash." "No?" queried the younger man, with a dangerous intonation. "No. I know the blood behind this chap. You won't win here. Blood will out." He smote his great fist on the desk top, and his laugh was a thunder which reverberated through the room. "Blood will out? The blood of John Bard?" asked Nash. Drew started. "Who said John Bard?" He grew gray again, the flush dying swiftly. He started to his feet and repeated in a great voice, sweeping the room with a wild glance: "Who said John Bard?" "I thought maybe this was his son," answered Nash. "You're a fool. Does he look like John Bard? No, there's only one person in the world he looks like." He strode again up and down the room, repeating in a deep monotone: "John Bard." Coming to a sharp halt, he said: "I don't want the rest of your story. The point is that the boy will be here within an hour, 2 hours. We've got work to do before that time." "Listen to me," answered the foreman. "Don't let him get inside this house. I'd rather take part of hell into a house of mine. Besides, if he sees me, he's coming here, but he's not going to see either of us. My mind is made up. Neither of us until I have him helpless." End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 23. The Comedy Setting. "Dead, you mean," broke in Nash, "because otherwise he'll never be helpless." "I tell you, Nash," said the other solemnly, "I can make him helpless with 1 minute of talk. My problem is to keep that devil harmless while he listens to me talk. Another thing, if he ever sees me Nothing but death will stop him from coming at my throat." "Speakin' personal," said the other coldly, "I never take no chances on fellers that might come at my throat." "I know. You're for the quick draw and the quick finish. But I'd rather die myself than have a hair on his head hurt. I mean that." Nash, his thoughts spinning, stood staring blankly. "I give up tryin' to figure it out. But if he's comin' here and you want to keep him safe, I'd better take a fresh hoss and get 20 miles away before night." "You'll do nothing of the kind. You'll stay here with me." "And face him without a gun?" asked the other incredulously. "Leave gun talk out of this. I think one of the boys looks a little like me. Lawler, isn't that his name?" Yes, a little bit like you. But he's got his thickness through the stomach and not through the chest." "Never mind. He's big and he's gray. Send for him and get the rest of the boys in here. They're around now for noon. Get everyone, understand? And make it fast." In 10 minutes they came to the office in a troop. Rough men, smooth men, little and big, fat and thin, but good cattlemen every one. "Boys," said Drew, "a tenderfoot is coming to the ranch today. I'm going to play a few jokes on him. First of all, I want you to know that until the stranger leaves the house, Lawler is going to take my place. He is going to be Drew. Understand?" "Lawler?" broke out several of them, and turned in surprise to a big, cheerful man, gray, plump, with monstrous white whiskers. "Because he looks a bit like me. First, you'll have to crop those whiskers, Lawler." He clutched at his threatened whiskers with both hands. "Crop 'em? Chief, you ain't maybe runnin' me a bit?" "Not a bit," said Drew, smiling faintly. "I'll make it worth your while." "It took me 30 years to raise these whiskers," said the cattleman, stern with rebuke. "Do you think I could be hired to give 'em up? It's like giving up some of myself." "Let 'em go, then. You can play the part, whiskers and all. The rest of you remember that Lawler is boss." "And brand that deep," growled Lawler, looking about with a frown. He had already stepped into his part. The others laughed loudly. "Steady there," called Drew. "Lawler starts as boss right now. Cut out the laughin'. I'll tell the rest of you what you're to do later on. In the meantime, just step out and I'll have a talk with Lawler on his part. We haven't much time to get ready. But remember, if one of you grins when Lawler gives an order, I'm done with that man, that's all." They filed out of the room, looking serious, and Drew concentrated on Lawler. "This sounds like a joke," he began, "but there's something serious about it. If you carry it through safely, there's 100 in it for you. If you fall down, why, you fall out of an easy place on this ranch." The big cattleman wiped growing perspiration from his forehead and considered his boss with plaintive eyes. "This tenderfoot who's comin' is green to the range, but he's a hard man, a fine horseman, a sure shot, and a natural fighter. More than that, he's comin' here lookin' for trouble, and he'll expect to get trouble from you." Lawler brushed his mustache anxiously. "Let someone else take the job, that's all. 100 ain't to be picked up every week, but I'll do without it. In my day I've done my share of brawlin' around, but I'm too stiff in the joints to make a fast draw and get away now. Let Nash take the job. He's gunfighter enough to handle this bad man for you." "No," said Drew, "not even Nash can handle this one." Then, with a mighty and explosive emphasis, "There ain't no possible use of me lingerin' around the job. So long. Wait, this young chap isn't going to murder you. I'll tell you this much. The man he wants is I. But he knows my face, not my name. He's been on the trail of that face for some time, and now he's trackin' it to the right house. But when he sees you and hears you called Drew, he'll be thrown off again." The other nodded gloomily. "I'm by way of a lightning rod, the tenderfoot with the hard hand. He strikes, and I sort of conduct the shock away from anything that'll burn, eh?" Drew overlooked the comment. "There are certain things about me you will have to know," and he explained carefully the story which Nash had told to Bard. "This Bard," asked the cautious Lawler, "is he any relation of old John Bard?" "Even if he were, it wouldn't make your position dangerous. The man he wants is I. He knows my face, not my name. Until he sees me he'll be perfectly reasonable, unless he's crossed. You must seem frank and above board." If you tell more lies than are necessary, he may get suspicious. And if he grows suspicious, the game is up, and will have to be finished with a gunplay. Remember that. He'll want to know about Nash. Tell him that Nash is a bad one, and that you've fixed him. He mustn't expect to find Nash here." Lawler rubbed his hands, like one coming from the cold outdoors to a warm fire. "I'm beginning to see the light. Let me at this, Bard. I'm going to get enough fun out of this to keep me laughing the rest of my life." "Good. But keep that laugh up your sleeve. If he asks questions, you'll have some solemn things to say." "Chief, when the time comes, there's going to be about a gallon of tears in my eyes." So Drew left to complete the other arrangements. If Bard reached the house, he must be requested to stay, and if he stayed, he must be fed and entertained. The difficulty in this way was that the servants in the big ranch house were two Chinese boys. They could never be trusted to help in the deception, so Drew summoned two of his men, Shorty Kilrain and Calamity Ben. Calamity had no other name but Ben, as far as anyone on the range had ever been able to learn. His nickname was derived from the most dolorous face between Eldara and Twin Rivers. Two pale blue eyes, set close together, stared out with an endless and wistful pathos. A long nose dropped below them, and his mouth curled down at the sides. He was hopelessly round-shouldered from too much and careless riding, and in attempting to straighten he only succeeded in throwing back his head, so that his lean neck generally was in a V shape, with the Adam's apple at the apex of the wedge. Shorty Kilrain received his early education at sea, and there learned a general handiness which stood him in stead when he came to the mountain desert. There was nothing which Shorty could not do with his hands, from making a knot to throwing a knife, and he was equally ready to oblige with either accomplishment. Drew proposed that he take charge of the kitchen, with Calamity Ben as an assistant. Shorty glowered on the rancher. "Me?" he said. "Me go into the galley and wait on a blasted tenderfoot? After he leaves you'll have a month off with pay, and some over, Shorty." "Don't want the month off." Drew considered him thoughtfully, following the precept of Walpole that every man had his price. "What do you want, Shorty?" The ex-sailor scratched his head, and then rolled his eyes with a dawning smile, as one who sees a vision of ultimate bliss. "Let one of the other boys catch my hoss out of the corral every morning and saddle him for me for a month. It's a bargain. What'll you do with the time? Sit on the fence and roll a cigarette like a blasted gentleman, and damn the eyes of the feller that's catching my hoss?" "And me?" said Calamity Ben. "What do I get?" "You get orders," answered Kilrain, "from me." Calamity regarded him, uncertain whether or not to fight the point, but apparently he decided the effort was not worth while. "There ain't going to be no luck come out of this," he said darkly. "Before this tenderfoot gets out of the house, we're all going to wish he was in hell." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 24. Samuel Hall. But with the stage set and the curtain ready to rise on the farce, the audience did not arrive until the shadow of the evening blotted the windows of the office where big Lawler waited impatiently, rehearsing his part. But when the lamp had been lighted, as though that were a signal for which the tenderfoot had waited, came a knock at the door of the room, and then it was jerked open, and the head of one of the cowpunchers inserted. "He's coming." The head disappeared, the door slammed. Lawler stretched both arms wide, shifted his belt, loosened his gun in the holster for the 50th time, and exhaled a long breath. Once more the door jerked open, and this time it was the head and sullen face of Nash, enlivened now by a peculiarly unpleasant smile. "He's here." As the door closed, the grim realization came to Lawler that he could not face the tenderfoot. His staring eyes and his pallor would betray him even if the jerking of his hands did not. He swung about in the comfortable chair, seized a book, and whisking it open, bowed his head to read. All that he saw was the dance of irregular black lines. Voices sounded through the hall outside. "Sure, he'll see you. Calamity Ben was saying. "And if you want to put up for the night, there ain't nobody more hospitable than the chief. Right in here, son." The door yawned. He could not see, for his back was resolutely toward it, and he was gripping the cover of the book hard to steady his hands. But he felt a breath of colder air from the outer hall. He felt, above all, a new presence peering in upon him, like a winter-starved lynx that might flatten its round face against the window and peer in at the lazy warmth and the comfort of the humans around the hearth inside. Some such feeling sent a chill through Lawler's blood. "Hello," called Calamity Ben. "Humph," grunted Lawler. "Got a visitor, Mr. Drew." "Bring him in." And Lawler cleared his throat. "All right, here he is." The door closed and Lawler snapped the book shut. "Drew," said a low voice. The cowpuncher turned in his chair. He intended to rise, but at the sound of that controlled menace he knew that his legs were too weak to answer that purpose. What he saw was a slender fellow, who stood with his head somewhat lowered while his eyes peered down from under contracted brows, as though the light were hurting them. His feet were braced apart and his hands dropped lightly on his hips, the very picture of a man ready to spring into action. Under the great brush of his mustache Lawler set his teeth, but he was instantly at ease. For if the sight of the stranger shook him to the very center, the other was even more obviously shocked by what he saw. The hands dropped limp from his hips and dangled idly at his sides. His body straightened almost with a jerk, as though he had been struck violently, and now, instead of that searching look, he was blinking down at his host. Lawler rose and extended a broad hand and an even broader smile. He was proud of the strength which had suddenly returned to his legs. "How are ye, stranger?" "Sure glad to see you." The other accepted the proffered hand automatically, like one moving in a dream. "Are you Drew?" "Sure am." "William Drew?" He still held the hand as if he were fearful of the vision escaping with that sensible bondage. "William Drew is right. Sit down. Make yourself at home." "Thanks," breathed the other, and as if that breath expelled with it all his strength he slumped into a chair and sat with a fascinated eye glued to his host. Lawler had time to mark now the signs of long and severe traveling which the other bore. Streaks of mud disfigured him from heel to shoulder, and his face was somewhat drawn, like a man who has gone to work fasting. "William Drew?" he repeated, more to himself than to Lawler. The latter formed a silent prayer of gratitude that he was not William Drew. "I'm forgetting myself," went on the tenderfoot, with a ghost of a smile. "My name is Bard, Anthony Bard." His glance narrowed again, and this time Lawler, remembering his part, pretended to start with surprise. "Bard?" "Yes, Anthony Bard." "Glad to know you. You ain't by any chance related to a John Bard?" "Why? Had a partner once by that name. Good old John Bard." He shook his head as though overcome by recollections. "I've heard something about you and your partner, Mr. Drew." "Yes? In fact, it seems to be a rather unusual story." "Well, it ain't common. John Bard. I'll tell the world there was a man." "Yes, he was." "What's that?" "He must have been," answered Anthony, "for all I've heard of him. I'm interested in what I scrapped together about you. You see, he carries the same name." "That's natural. How long since you ate?" "Last night." "The hell! Starved?" "Rather. It's near chow time. Will you eat now or wait for the regular spread?" "I think I can wait, thank you. A little drink right now to help you along, eh?" He strode over to the open door. "Hey, Shorty!" For answer there came only the wail of an old pirate song. "Oh, my name's Sam'l Hall, Sam'l Hall. My name's Sam'l Hall, Sam'l Hall. My name's Sam'l Hall, and I hate you one and all. You're a gang of muckers all, damn your eyes." "Listen," said Lawler, turning to his guest with a deprecating wave of the hand. "A cook what sings. Which in the old days I wouldn't have had a bum like that around the place. But there ain't no choosin' now." The voice from the kitchen rolled out louder. "I killed a man, they said, so they said. I killed a man, they said, so they said. I killed a man, they said, for I hit him on the head and left him there for dead, damn your eyes." "Hey, Shorty Kilrain!" bellowed the aggravated host. He turned to Bard. "What do you do with a bum like that for a cook?" "Pay him wages and keep him around to sing songs. I like this one. Listen." They put me in the quad, in the quad. They put me in the quad, in the quad. They put me in the quad. They chained me to a rod, and they left me there, by God, damn your eyes. Kilrain, come here. Make it fast or I'll damn your eyes. He explained to Bard. Got to be hard with these fellers, or you never get nowhere with 'em. Yo ho, answered the voice of the singer, and approached, booming. The parson he did come, he did come. The parson he did come, did come. The parson he did come. He looked almighty glum. He talked of kingdom come. Damn your eyes. And Shorty loomed in the doorway and caught his hand to his forehead in a nautical salute. He had one bad eye, and now it squinted villainously as if he were the real Samuel Hall. Right-o, sir. What d'you have, mate? Don't mate me, you ignorant sweepin' of the South Sea, but trot up some red-eye and gallop. The ex-sailor shifted his quid so that it stuck far out in the opposite cheek, with such violence of pressure that a little white spot appeared through the tan of the skin. He regarded Lawler for a silent moment with bowful eyes. "What the hell are you looking at?" roared the other. "On your way." The features of Kilrain twitched spasmodically. "Right-o, sir." Another salute and he was off, his voice coming back less and less distinctly. "So up the rope I'll go, I will go. So up the rope I'll go, I'll go. So up the rope I'll go, with a crowd all down below, yelling, 'Sam, I told you so!' Damn your eyes." End of chapter 24.